Today we're going to look at how to use Outboard gear or Reamp with the Tascam Model 12, which is a cool interface and one I've been using a little over 6 months. There's a lot to like about it, and it does a lot of things, though it has some weird things about it too. It's got its own peculiarities, and it can be difficult to find out how to do certain things that you might want to do. I spent several hours trying to figure out how to do this, looking on YouTube, looking at old forum posts, and eventually I found a forum post or two, and I still had to wrap my head around it and try it out to finally figure out how to do it and that it indeed worked, because this is also a portable recorder, and so some of the functions, if you look up stuff about it, will be more dedicated towards that, and it's a little different than using it as an interface. Nobody's done a video about this on YouTube, so if you're in this situation, I want to save you the headache and the time of trying to figure out how to do it and explain it in a very straightforward way, because it's easy to understand once you understand it. And you know the process, and you understand how this mixer works and what it is looking to do. On most interfaces, it's a simple matter of sending from a line output in the back of it to a line input. And my old Tascam US 1800 does it just that way. You tell it in your DAW, send to this output, and then record on this input. It's very straightforward. However, on the Model 12, it's not so easy. It has aux outputs and sub outputs. And what exactly those are and what they do is where it gets a little bit confusing, because you can't assign the aux output or the sub output in your DAW. Instead, you'll see 10 outputs. What are those 10 outputs? Well, they're the inputs. The input channels can work as output channels, but if you plug a cable into one of your inputs and set it as an output and try to record back through another channel, you're not going to get anything. So you have to send from your DAW to one of the outputs or input channels, send the information there, but then route it through the aux channels and the sub channels, either or. And you could theoretically do up to 4 different mono signals or 2 stereo signals, one through the aux and one through the sub, and then record them right back through the front, just like normal. So that's the confusing thing. You have to send from the PC to an output channel, which is one of the 10 channels on the front of your mixer, and then connect from the aux to an input, and then send your output channel to the aux mix, because the aux mix can be sent from multiple channels, which I guess makes sense in some way, in some scenario where you wanted to perhaps a different headphone mix. You could send a bunch of signals live, any of the channels, to the aux, create a different mix with different levels for a different band member. If you have 2 people recording together that want different mixes, you could do that. I guess you could do 3 mixes with the sub outputs, but it's a weird way to handle outboard gear when you just want a line output, and I guess there was no room for it. Who knows? So let's go on over to another clip of me explaining this up close on the Model 12, and then we'll look at how I do it in Reaper, and I'll show you the plugins I use, though this method could work with any DAW. Our first step is to pick an output channel. Now, because 1 and 2 are our default channels for desktop sounds, another quirk of the Model 12, I just leave those alone, and I'm going to use channel 9 and 10 for mono or stereo output. In Reaper, I'm going to be using reinsert, but you can use a normal hardware output just with some downsides, and I'll get to that in a minute. Most of this should also apply to any DAW. Once you've picked your output channel, you'll need to switch the mode to PC and make sure your input channels are set to live. Back on the output channel, push in the sub switch for the sub output. Now bring up the faders on both your output channel and your sub mix so we get sound from them. Likewise, for the aux outputs, bring up the aux send knob and the aux output. Make sure no unwanted channels are sending to sub or aux. Now you can take cables from the sub or aux outs on the back of your Model 12 to the input of your amp or effects, and the output of that can go to any other open channel on the mixer to record as usual. This setup can work with either mono or stereo effects, and to save time, you could record 2 mono channels simultaneously, and those can both have stereo effects. If you want up to 4 outputs, you can route another 2 channels to aux 1 and 2 or sub left and right, depending on what you're not using already. Moving over to Reaper, I have a dry guitar recording here that I'm going to reamp through some pedals and an amp. And with pedals, you can easily reamp a dry guitar signal through one pedal or a whole pedal board, and you can still use an amp sim afterwards. You could also feed input effects like a gate or pitch correction, anything you want, from the DAW back out into physical hardware and then back in to be processed, perhaps with more plugins. I'm going to use the reinsert effect because it has a handy latency detector that will allow you to match up the reamp signal to your mix to see if you like how the pedals or amp or hardware effects are sitting in the context of your mix. You can set up both channels for stereo effects or just one channel for mono effects. With the automatic device latency adjustment turned off, you can use ping detect and it will measure and compensate for the latency of your interface. Another benefit to using reinsert rather than a regular hardware output in the routing window is that you can easily copy it from one channel to another without having to go in and set up the routing options again. It's faster if you're reamping a bunch of things to just copy the one plugin over to the next channel you want to use as an output. You can use effects before reinsert like a noise gate or even a distortion plugin or other effect into a reamp or hardware, or an amp sim into a hardware delay, reverb, whatever you want. It's very important to match the output signal to the input signal so the hardware is getting the right level. You can do this with a pedal that's off or a cable straight from the sub or aux out that you're using back into the input. I try to keep everything at -12 dB when recording, so I have a consistent level in my recordings, and the Model 12 has a handy guideline at -12 dB right there on the screen. I keep my preamp at the same level as I do when recording straight in with a guitar, and I adjust the output fader so it's the same level going back in. I have noticed a quirk where aux 1 will send if both the knobs are up, but aux 2 will only send if both the knobs and the fader is up, and the submix requires both the faders on the output channel and the submix. You can use those faders or knobs to adjust the volume of the signal you're sending so that it matches both in and out. Just as a quick recap, you want to first pick an output channel that you're going to use in the software, and then the cable is going to be hooked up to either the aux outputs or the sub outputs. The cable does not send from this channel like you might expect. It sends from the aux output or the sub output. Make sure the mode is set to PC, and then if you're using the sub outputs, we have to engage the sub button and make sure the main, solo, and mute are all off, and then make sure your faders are up on the submix and the channel you're outputting. If you're using the aux channels, they're controlled by these orange knobs. Aux 1 has to be up on the channel, as well as in this monitoring section. Aux 2 has to be up on this channel, as well as the monitoring section, and the fader. However, aux 1 does not require the fader to be up. It works the same either way. Then hook up your cables from either the aux outputs or the sub outputs in the back of the Model 12 out to the gear you want to record with, and then the output of the gear back into other open channels, which are set to live. The important thing to remember is that the output's going to be set inside the computer, but then we are going to be sending from this channel with no cable using the sub or aux outs to a separate mix, and then we're recording that separate mix out of the sub or aux output. So it's a little more convoluted than simply sending it to output number 1 on the back of the unit, hooking up a cable from output 1, and then going back in through the front, which is how it would work on most interfaces. But here we have to create a submix from the channel and then record the submix. So it's not too hard, but it does require that you have everything set up correctly or you won't get any sound. So I hope you understand all this. I've explained it several times on purpose so that you will hopefully wrap your head around exactly how this works so that you feel confident doing it and memorizing it and using it. It's great to have the ability to do this because there's a lot of uses for it. You could take dry guitars or any instrument. You could run it through some pedals. You could run it through some pedals before going to an amp sim, for example, or from an amp sim, an already wet signal, to a hardware reverb or delay you like. You can, of course, reamp it through a tube amp or a modeling pedal. You can, of course, use it with outboard gear like a compressor, an EQ, a reverb, whatever. And I've been playing around with some outboard gear recently, which kind of prompted this, and I couldn't really get it to work, so I resorted to using my old interface just because I understood it and I could get the signal flow to be correct. Whereas this took a little more digging, but I knew it must be possible because who makes an interface that can't do this fairly basic function that every interface should be able to do unless it's a total budget model? And even then, you could always use the monitor outs. I have done that actually plenty, making IRs, and that works, but you have to disconnect your monitors. And if you want to mix live through a piece of hardware gear or reamp and make sure the tone sounds good in your mix, that won't help you because you'll be shooting blind and just saying, well, let's print this and hope it works, reconnect the monitors. And it's total hassle. So anyways, I hope this saves you some trouble and helps you to make some better stuff and know your gear better. Consider liking and subscribing if this was helpful for you, and I will see you in the next video.